The sound of bone cracking against bone echoed across the gas station parking lot, but it wasn't the first sound that mattered. It was the second one, the wet gasp of a pregnant woman hitting concrete, her hands instinctively wrapping around her swollen belly as if love alone could protect what violence had just targeted. Marcus Donovan, CEO of Donovan Enterprises, stood over his wife with fists still clenched and rage still burning in his eyes, completely unaware that the man pumping gas 3 cars away wasn't just any witness. He was Ethan Reid, Navy SEAL, Caroline's older brother, and the last person Marcus should have ever let see what kind of man he really was behind closed doors. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. This is the story of how power becomes poison, how love turns to survival, and how one moment of witnessed violence can detonate a life so carefully constructed that even the person living inside it had forgotten what freedom felt like. Caroline Donovan had been a bright, ambitious marketing director at a tech startup when Marcus first noticed her at an industry conference 3 years ago. She wasn't trying to be noticed, wasn't performing the careful choreography of networking that everyone else executed with practiced precision. She was standing near the coffee station, genuinely laughing at something her colleague said, her whole face transforming with a kind of joy that made Marcus forget the presentation he was supposed to be giving in 10 minutes. He'd built his empire on reading people, on understanding what they wanted before they knew they wanted it, and something about Caroline's unguarded happiness told him she was different from the women who usually orbited his world. She didn't know who he was, didn't recognize his name when he introduced himself, and that anonymity felt like oxygen after years of suffocating in his own reputation. They talked for 47 minutes about things that had nothing to do with business, about the documentary she'd watched about ocean conservation, about the vintage bookstore near her apartment that smelled like time travel, about her dream of one day starting a nonprofit that taught marketing skills to small business owners who couldn't afford agencies. Marcus fell in love the way ambitious men fall in love, completely and territorially, deciding she was his before she'd even agreed to a first date. He courted her with the same strategic intensity he applied to hostile takeovers, expensive dinners at restaurants with 6-month waiting lists, weekend trips to wine country in private helicopters, gifts that cost more than her monthly rent presented like they were casual gestures instead of calculated demonstrations of what life with him could provide. Caroline resisted at first, uncomfortable with the extravagance, insisting she could pay for her own meals and didn't need jewelry that came in boxes with security guards. But Marcus was patient in the way predators are patient, slowly recalibrating her sense of normal until luxury felt like affection and control felt like care. He loved the way she challenged him, the way she'd call out his arrogance during business dinners and make him laugh about taking himself too seriously. He loved how she'd show up to his penthouse in jeans and a sweater, completely unbothered by the fact that his last girlfriend had treated his home like a fashion runway. He loved that she had her own career, her own ambitions, her own life that didn't revolve around him, and he told himself he loved her independence even as he began systematically dismantling it. The proposal came 8 months into their relationship, during a sunset dinner on a yacht he'd rented for the occasion, with a ring that cost more than most people's cars and a speech about how she'd made him believe in something beyond quarterly earnings and shareholder value. Caroline said yes because she loved him, because she believed the man who listened to her talk about nonprofits and ocean documentaries was more real than the CEO who commanded boardrooms with surgical precision, because she thought love could soften the sharp edges of ambition into something that looked like partnership. The wedding was featured in 3 magazines, a carefully orchestrated event that cost $500,000 and felt less like a celebration and more like a merger announcement. Caroline's family, working class and practical, looked uncomfortable among the corporate elite and old money aristocrats who treated the reception like a networking opportunity disguised as a party. Her brother Ethan, on leave from his SEAL team, stood beside her in his dress uniform and whispered during the ceremony, "You sure about this, Care? This guy feels like he's playing a part, not living a life." She'd squeezed his hand and smiled, certain that Ethan's protective instincts were just overactive, that Marcus was exactly who he appeared to be when they were alone. The first crack in the facade appeared 3 months after the wedding, during a work dinner where Caroline laughed too loudly at a colleague's joke. Marcus said nothing at the restaurant, maintained his charming public persona, smiled and networked and played the role of supportive husband with practiced ease. But in the car driving home, his hand tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, and his voice dropped into a tone she'd never heard before, cold and surgical and designed to cut without leaving visible marks. "You embarrassed me tonight, making a spectacle of yourself, flirting with that junior partner like you're not wearing my ring." Caroline's confusion turned to defensive explanation, insisting she was just being friendly, just laughing at a harmless joke, but Marcus cut her off with words that felt like doors slamming shut. "Friendly looks desperate when you're married to me. You represent my brand now, and I need you to act like you understand what that means." The word brand stuck in her throat like glass, but she apologized anyway, confused by the sudden transformation of the man who used to love her independence. That night, Marcus made love to her with a tenderness that felt like apology, whispering that he was sorry, that he was stressed from work, that he just loved her so much the thought of other men looking at her made him crazy. Caroline chose to believe the tenderness instead of the control, chose to see his jealousy as passion instead of possession, and that choice became the first brick in a wall that would eventually trap her inside a marriage she couldn't escape. The pattern established itself slowly, like water carving stone over time until the damage is too deep to repair. Marcus would criticize her clothes, suggesting she wore something more appropriate for a CEO's wife, something that commanded respect instead of attention. He'd comment on her weight, noting that she'd gained a few pounds and maybe she should consider a trainer since her body reflected on him now. He'd monitor her phone, asking casual questions about who she'd been texting, why she needed to talk to her college friends so frequently when she had him. He'd isolate her from her career, suggesting that working was unnecessary now that she was married to him, that his income was more than sufficient, that he needed her to focus on being present for him instead of scattered across projects that didn't really matter. Each criticism came wrapped in concern, each restriction disguised as care, each loss of autonomy presented as evidence of how much he loved her and wanted to protect her from a world that would take advantage of her kindness. Caroline quit her job 6 months into the marriage, not because she wanted to but because Marcus made it impossible to stay, scheduling trips during her important presentations, creating conflicts that forced her to choose between his needs and her career until the choice felt inevitable. She told herself it was temporary, that she could always go back, that being Mrs. Marcus Donovan came with responsibilities that required her full attention. Her friends called less frequently, eventually stopped calling at all when she canceled plans repeatedly because Marcus needed her at home or had surprised her with a trip she couldn't refuse. Her family noticed the change, the way Caroline's laugh sounded rehearsed instead of genuine, the way she flinched slightly when Marcus touched her in public, the way she'd become an edited version of herself, careful and measured and performing the role of happy wife with the same precision Marcus performed the role of devoted husband. Ethan confronted her during a holiday dinner, pulling her aside in the kitchen while Marcus held court in the living room, telling investment stories that made him sound like a genius instead of someone who'd inherited a company and scaled it through ruthlessness rather than innovation. "You're disappearing, Ethan said quietly, his trained eye catching details civilians missed, the way she positioned herself to always be visible to Marcus, the way her shoulders tensed when she heard his laugh from the other room, the hypervigilance of someone living in a combat zone disguised as a marriage. This isn't what love looks like. This is what control looks like, and I've seen enough of it overseas to recognize the signs." Caroline insisted everything was fine, that Marcus was just protective, that marriage required adjustments and compromise, that Ethan didn't understand the pressures of being married to someone as successful and demanding as Marcus. But her voice carried the flat effect of someone reciting a script instead of living a truth, and Ethan left that dinner with a knot in his stomach that felt like premonition. The first time Marcus hit her, it was almost an accident, almost something that could be explained away as unintentional violence born from stress instead of malice. They'd been arguing about money, about the fact that Caroline had used their joint credit card to buy her mother a birthday gift without asking his permission first. Marcus had been drinking, his third glass of bourbon in an hour, and his words slurred slightly as he accused her of being irresponsible with finances that weren't really hers since she didn't contribute to them. Caroline defended herself, voice rising to match his, saying the money was theirs not his, that marriage meant partnership not ownership, and those words triggered something in Marcus that had been waiting for permission to emerge. His hand connected with her face before either of them fully processed what was happening, the impact turning her head sideways and filling her mouth with the copper taste of blood from where her teeth cut the inside of her cheek. The silence that followed felt like the universe holding its breath, waiting to see which version of reality would solidify, the one where Marcus was a man who hit his wife or the one where this was a terrible mistake that would never happen again. Marcus chose the mistake narrative, dropping to his knees immediately, sobbing apologies that sounded genuine because they were genuine in that moment, before the pattern calcified into repetition. He swore it would never happen again, that he was horrified by what he'd done, that stress from work and alcohol had created a perfect storm of circumstances that would never align again. He held her while she cried, stroked her hair and whispered promises about therapy and anger management and being the husband she deserved. Caroline wanted desperately to believe him because the alternative meant accepting that she'd married a monster, meant acknowledging that her life had become a trap she'd walked into willingly. She told herself it was an isolated incident, that everyone makes mistakes, that love means forgiveness and second chances. She covered the bruise on her face with makeup and avoided her family for 2 weeks until it faded completely, rehearsing explanations she never had to use because nobody asked questions when you were married to a powerful man who'd never shown anything but charm to the outside world. Marcus was gentle for 3 months afterward, treating her with exaggerated tenderness, buying gifts that felt like penance, scheduling the couple's therapy he'd promised even though he spent every session performing the role of concerned husband working hard to save his marriage. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. But violence, once introduced into a relationship, doesn't disappear through apology. It just waits, patient and inevitable, for the next trigger to justify its return. The second time he hit her, there was less apology and more justification, explanations about how she'd pushed him to it by questioning his decisions in front of his business partners, by making him look weak when he needed to project strength. The third time, he didn't apologize at all, just told her coldly that if she didn't want to get hit, she should learn to control her mouth and show him the respect he deserved. The pattern became predictable, almost ritualistic, tension building over days or weeks until Marcus found a reason, any reason, to unleash the violence that simmered constantly beneath his polished exterior. Caroline learned to read the signs, the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes went flat and cold before his hands started moving, the specific tone of voice that meant she had approximately 30 seconds to either de-escalate or brace for impact. She became an expert in survival mathematics, calculating whether apologizing would reduce the damage or increase it, whether silence was safer than explanation, whether crying would trigger his guilt or his rage. She stopped going out because explaining bruises required energy she didn't have, stopped talking to her family because hearing their voices reminded her of who she used to be, stopped imagining escape because Marcus had made it clear what would happen if she tried. "You think anyone will believe you," he'd said once, standing over her after she'd suggested leaving, his voice carrying the casual certainty of someone who'd already wargamed every possible scenario. "I'm Marcus Donovan. I employ 300 people and sit on 2 nonprofit boards. You're an unemployed housewife with no income and no prospects. Try to leave and I'll destroy what's left of your pathetic little life." Then Caroline discovered she was pregnant, and the mathematics of survival became exponentially more complicated. She took the test alone in the bathroom of their penthouse, watching the positive indicator appear with a feeling that was equal parts terror and hope, understanding that a baby changed everything while changing nothing. Part of her believed, desperately wanted to believe, that fatherhood would transform Marcus into the man she'd married, that responsibility for a child would soften the violence back into the tenderness he'd shown her in the beginning. But a larger, more realistic part of her understood that pregnancy made her more vulnerable, not less, that bringing a child into a violent home wasn't hope but cruelty. She told Marcus over dinner at a restaurant because public spaces felt safer than private ones, watching his face carefully as she explained that they were going to be parents in 7 months. His initial reaction was excitement, genuine joy that made him look almost like the man she'd fallen in love with, talking about nurseries and college funds and building a legacy that extended beyond corporate success. For 2 blissful weeks, Caroline allowed herself to believe that everything would be different, that the baby growing inside her would be the bridge back to safety. Then she burned dinner accidentally, the smoke detector screaming while she tried to salvage chicken that had cooked too long, and Marcus's fist connected with her stomach with enough force to double her over, gasping. The baby survived that first assault, confirmed through an emergency ultrasound Caroline lied about needing, claiming she'd felt cramping when the truth was she'd felt her husband trying to murder what neither of them had planned but she already loved with protective ferocity. The doctor, a kind woman in her 50s who'd probably seen this script played out too many times, asked careful questions about Caroline's home life, about whether she felt safe, about resources available if she needed help leaving a dangerous situation. Caroline performed the role of content pregnant wife with the same precision she'd learned to perform every other survival role, insisting everything was fine, that she was just anxious about being a first-time mother. The doctor gave her a card anyway, contact information for a domestic violence shelter, tucked into discharge paperwork where Marcus wouldn't see it, and Caroline threw it away in the hospital bathroom because hope felt more dangerous than despair. The pregnancy should have protected her, but instead it became another target, another weapon Marcus used to reinforce his control. He'd mock her changing body, calling her fat and unattractive, suggesting that she was letting herself go in ways that embarrassed him. He'd threaten the baby explicitly during arguments, saying he'd make sure she lost it if she didn't learn to behave, that pregnancy didn't make her untouchable, just more pathetic. Caroline lived in constant fear that his violence would kill what she decided to protect at any cost, that her body would fail the one job that mattered more than her own survival. She started planning her escape with the methodical precision of someone who understood she had one chance and failure meant death, hers or the baby's or both. She stole small amounts of cash from Marcus's wallet, $20 here, $50 there, amounts small enough that he wouldn't notice but that accumulated slowly into what might eventually be enough for a security deposit on an apartment in a city where he couldn't find her. She researched domestic violence resources in neighboring states, memorizing phone numbers because saving them in her phone felt too risky. She contacted her brother Ethan through a fake social media account Marcus didn't monitor, sending careful messages that never explicitly said what was happening but contained enough coded language that someone who loved her would understand. Ethan responded immediately, his messages carrying military efficiency and protective rage barely contained behind strategic questions about when and where and how he could help. They'd arranged to meet 3 times, but each time Marcus changed plans last minute or Caroline lost her nerve, terrified that attempting escape would trigger violence worse than staying. The 4th attempt happened at a gas station 43 miles outside the city where they'd attended a business dinner that had gone badly. Marcus had spent the evening drinking and seething about a deal that had fallen through, about partners who'd questioned his judgment, about humiliations real and imagined that required someone to pay for his bruised ego. Caroline sat in the passenger seat of his Mercedes, 7 months pregnant and exhausted, knowing that the drive home would include verbal abuse at minimum, physical violence if she said the wrong thing or failed to say the right thing or simply existed in a way that reminded Marcus he was capable of failure. He pulled into the gas station with aggressive precision, his movements sharp with barely contained rage, and got out to pump gas without saying a word to her. Caroline sat frozen in the passenger seat, watching through the window as other people moved through their normal lives, filling their tanks and buying coffee and existing in a world that felt inaccessible from where she sat. Then she saw him, standing 3 cars away, his profile instantly recognizable even though she hadn't seen him in person for 8 months. Ethan, her brother, her protector, the person she'd been trying to reach for weeks through encrypted messages in desperate hope. Their eyes met across the gas station parking lot, and Caroline saw the exact moment Ethan registered her condition, saw the way his entire body went still with the predatory awareness of someone trained to identify threats and eliminate them. He started walking toward the Mercedes, his movements casual but purposeful, and Caroline felt her heart accelerate with a mixture of hope and terror because this wasn't the plan, this was chance or fate or divine intervention, and she didn't know if rescue arrived like this or if coincidence would make everything worse. Marcus finished pumping gas and opened the driver's door, sliding into the seat with the bourbon-soaked aggression of someone looking for a target to make himself feel powerful again. He looked at Caroline and something in her face triggered him, maybe the hope he saw there, maybe just her existence, and his hand moved faster than thought, connecting with her face with enough force to snap her head sideways into the window. The second blow landed in her ribs, his fist driving into the space just above where their baby was growing, and Caroline heard the crack before she felt the pain, understood with horrible clarity that something inside her had broken that might not heal. She opened the car door and fell more than stepped out, hitting the concrete parking lot with her hands still wrapped protectively around her stomach, trying to shield what Marcus had just targeted. The world narrowed to three things in that moment: the searing pain in her ribs, the baby moving inside her like it was asking if everything was okay, and Ethan's voice cutting through the parking lot with military command and barely controlled rage, "Get away from her. Right now. Or I swear to God this ends with you in pieces." Marcus turned toward the voice with the arrogant dismissiveness of someone who'd spent his entire life believing money and status made him untouchable. He saw Ethan standing 20 feet away, saw the military posture and the cold calculation in his eyes, and made the catastrophic mistake of thinking this was a situation he could control through intimidation. "This is a private matter between me and my wife," Marcus said, his voice carrying the boardroom authority that usually made people back down, trying to position himself between Ethan and Caroline like ownership was a legal defense against intervention. "I suggest you mind your own business before you do something you'll regret." Ethan moved with the efficient violence of someone trained to neutralize threats without wasting energy on posturing or warnings. He closed the distance between them in 3 strides, his fist connecting with Marcus's jaw with surgical precision, the kind of strike designed to disorient rather than immediately incapacitate. Marcus stumbled backward, shock registering on his face before rage replaced it, and he lunged forward with the uncoordinated aggression of someone who'd never actually been in a real fight, someone whose violence had only ever been directed at people who couldn't fight back. The fight, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 90 seconds. Ethan moved like water around Marcus's wild swings, redirecting momentum and using Marcus's own force against him, each counterstrike landing with the precise brutality of someone who understood exactly how much damage the human body could sustain before crossing from punishment into permanent injury. Marcus went down hard, his expensive suit scraping against concrete, blood streaming from his nose and a cut above his eye that would require stitches. Ethan stood over him, breathing steady and controlled, his voice dropping into the dangerous calm of someone exercising restraint that could evaporate at any moment. "You put your hands on her again, you even think about putting your hands on her again, and they won't find enough of you to identify through dental records. That's not a threat, that's a promise from someone who's made bodies disappear in countries you can't pronounce." The words weren't performed for dramatic effect, they were delivered with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating weather conditions rather than making threats, and something in Marcus's alcohol-soaked brain recognized that this wasn't a negotiation he could win. Other witnesses had gathered at a safe distance, people filming on their phones and calling 911, the kind of public audience that would make this incident impossible for Marcus to bury through lawyers and carefully managed PR statements. Caroline was still on the ground, one hand clutching her ribs and the other wrapped protectively around her stomach, tears streaming down her face that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the complicated relief of finally being seen, finally having someone intervene in violence that had felt inevitable and inescapable. Ethan knelt beside his sister with a gentleness that completely contradicted the violence he'd just delivered, his hands hovering over her uncertainly because he wanted to help but didn't know where she was hurt or how badly. Talk to me. Where does it hurt? Is the baby okay?" His voice cracked on the word baby, the protective rage giving way momentarily to fear that he'd arrived too late to prevent permanent damage, that his sister and his unborn niece or nephew might be casualties of his delay in understanding what was happening in her marriage. Caroline tried to speak but the pain in her ribs made breathing feel like swallowing glass, each inhale a sharp reminder that Marcus's fist had connected with bone and something had given way under the impact. She managed to gasp out words that came in fragments between painful breaths. "Baby's moving. Ribs. Can't breathe right." The sound of sirens approached from a distance, multiple emergency vehicles responding to calls about a fight at a gas station, and Ethan stayed beside Caroline, one hand finally settling carefully on her shoulder because that seemed like the only place he could touch without causing more pain. Paramedics arrived with practiced efficiency, assessing Caroline first because her pregnancy made her the priority patient, checking vital signs and asking questions about pain levels and fetal movement while a second team attended to Marcus, who was sitting against his Mercedes looking dazed and furious in equal measure. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s named Sarah, performed a quick evaluation and made immediate decisions with the authority of someone who'd seen too many pregnant women injured by partners. "We need to transport her now. Possible broken ribs, definite blunt force trauma, and at 7 months we can't risk any complications with the pregnancy. Sir, you can ride with us if you're family." She directed the last sentence at Ethan, who nodded and stayed close to Caroline as they loaded her onto a gurney, his presence the only thing keeping her from complete panic at the thought of being separated from the one person who'd finally protected her. Police officers took statements from witnesses, their body cameras recording testimony that would make this case impossible to dismiss as a domestic dispute that could be handled privately. Multiple bystanders described watching Marcus strike his pregnant wife, watching her fall, watching a stranger intervene to stop what appeared to be an ongoing assault. One witness, an older man who'd been filling his truck at the next pump over, told officers with visible disgust, that man was beating his pregnant wife in broad daylight like it was normal, like he'd done it before and expected to get away with it. Thank God someone stopped him before he killed her and that baby. Marcus was arrested on assault charges despite his protests that this was all a misunderstanding, that his wife had tripped and he'd been trying to help her, narratives that contradicted both the physical evidence and the chorus of witness statements. The officers weren't interested in his explanations or his lawyer's phone number or his threats about making their lives difficult. They'd seen the footage from multiple phones, seen Caroline's bruised face and the protective way she held her stomach, and recognized the specific pattern of defensive injuries consistent with domestic violence rather than accidental falls. At the hospital, Caroline underwent a series of tests that felt invasive and terrifying, ultrasounds to check the baby's condition, X-rays of her ribs that required careful positioning to minimize radiation exposure, CT scans to rule out internal bleeding that could complicate her pregnancy. Ethan stayed in the waiting room, pacing with the restless energy of someone trained for action forced into passive observation, texting updates to their mother and trying to control the rage that kept threatening to send him back to that gas station to finish what he'd started. The doctor who finally emerged with Caroline's results was a maternal-fetal medicine specialist named Dr. Martinez, a woman who carried the exhausted compassion of someone who'd spent 20 years helping women survive complicated pregnancies. She delivered information with careful optimism designed to provide relief without minimizing the seriousness of what had happened. "The baby appears to be fine, strong heartbeat, good movement, no signs of placental abruption or distress. Caroline has 3 broken ribs on her right side, significant bruising, and we're monitoring her closely for any respiratory complications. She's incredibly lucky considering the force of the impact." The word lucky felt obscene in context, as if surviving an assault from your husband while 7 months pregnant constituted good fortune rather than basic human right to exist without violence. Ethan asked the question that mattered most, "Can I see her?" and Dr. Martinez nodded, leading him through sterile corridors to a private room where Caroline lay connected to monitors that tracked her heartbeat and the baby's, both rhythms steady but her face carrying the devastated expression of someone processing trauma in real time. She started crying the moment Ethan walked through the door, not the quiet tears she'd learned to cry silently during her marriage but full-body sobs that hurt her broken ribs and didn't care, releasing 2 years of accumulated fear and shame and desperate hope that someone would finally see what was happening and help her escape. Ethan sat carefully on the edge of her hospital bed and held her while she cried, not saying anything because what was there to say that would make any of this better, that would undo the months of violence she'd survived alone. When she could finally speak, Caroline's words came out raw and honest in ways she'd forgotten how to be. "I tried to leave. So many times. I had money saved. I had plans. But he said he'd kill me if I tried. Said nobody would believe me. Said he'd make sure I never saw my baby again even if I survived leaving him. And I believed him because why wouldn't I? He's Marcus Donovan. He has lawyers and money and a reputation that makes him untouchable." Ethan's jaw tightened with the effort of controlling his response, forcing himself to listen instead of react, to let Caroline speak without interrupting with the violent solutions his training provided for problems like Marcus. I got your messages, he said quietly. The coded ones through that fake account. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't realize how bad it was. I should have come sooner. Should have forced the issue instead of waiting for you to tell me you were ready to leave. I'm sorry, Care. I'm so fucking sorry I didn't protect you from this. Caroline shook her head, wincing at the movement because even small gestures hurt with broken ribs. You couldn't have known. I was careful. I covered bruises. I lied to everyone. I performed the role of happy wife so convincingly that even I almost believed it sometimes. This isn't your fault. This is his fault, only his. She paused, her hand moving to rest on her swollen belly where their baby was still moving, oblivious to the violence that had nearly ended both their lives. But I need help now. Real help. Because when he gets out of jail, and he will get out because men like him always do, he's going to come for me. And next time he might not stop until one of us is dead. The reality of their situation settled over both of them like concrete, heavy and inescapable. Marcus had been arrested on assault charges, but with his resources and legal team, he'd likely make bail within 24 hours. Restraining orders were just paper that didn't stop fists or bullets. Witness testimony was powerful but not absolute, especially against someone with Marcus's money and influence. The system that was supposed to protect victims of domestic violence was designed by people who'd never had to hide from someone with unlimited resources and a personal vendetta. Ethan pulled out his phone and made calls with military efficiency, activating networks most civilians didn't know existed. He contacted a former SEAL teammate who worked private security, explaining the situation and arranging 24-hour protection for Caroline effective immediately. He called his commanding officer and requested emergency leave, citing family crisis, knowing that his team would understand even if he couldn't explain details over unsecured lines. He researched domestic violence lawyers who specialized in high-profile cases, looking for someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Marcus's legal team or his reputation. A social worker named Jennifer came to Caroline's hospital room in the evening, carrying resources and asking questions with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that victims of abuse needed time and safety to tell their stories completely. She explained options that Caroline hadn't known existed: emergency protective orders that could be issued within hours, safe houses designed specifically for pregnant women fleeing violence, legal aid organizations that provided free representation to abuse survivors who couldn't afford private attorneys. The hardest part, Jennifer said carefully, is that you're going to have to testify against him. The assault at the gas station gives prosecutors a strong case because there were multiple witnesses and video footage, but domestic violence charges require the victim's cooperation. Marcus's lawyers will try to discredit you, will paint this as an isolated incident caused by stress or alcohol, will suggest you're making false accusations for financial gain in a divorce. You need to be prepared for character assassination dressed up as legal defense. Caroline felt the weight of that reality pressing down on her with the same suffocating heaviness as Marcus's fists had. Speaking publicly about the abuse meant exposing herself to judgment from people who would question why she stayed, why she didn't leave sooner, why she married him in the first place. It meant becoming a cautionary tale instead of a survivor, entertainment for people who consumed domestic violence stories like they were dramatic fiction rather than lived trauma. But staying silent meant allowing Marcus to continue the narrative that she was unstable or lying, meant potentially losing custody of her baby to a man who'd used violence against both of them. I'll testify, Caroline said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'll tell them everything. Every time he hit me. Every threat he made. Every time I covered bruises and lied to my family. I'll tell them about the night he punched me in the stomach when I was 3 months pregnant. About the time he locked me in our bedroom for 2 days because I'd called my mother without permission. About how he controlled every dollar I spent and monitored every text message and isolated me from everyone who loved me. I'll tell them everything because staying silent is what allowed this to happen for 2 years. The decision felt simultaneously empowering and terrifying, like jumping from a burning building because staying inside meant certain death but the fall might kill you anyway. Jennifer squeezed Caroline's hand and promised she wouldn't be alone through the legal process, that advocates would be present at every hearing and deposition, that her testimony would be believed and documented and used to protect not just her but other women Marcus might target in the future. Marcus made bail the next morning, exactly as Ethan had predicted, posting $200,000 like it was pocket change and walking out of jail with his lawyer issuing statements about false accusations and misunderstandings and his client's intent to vigorously defend himself against these baseless charges. The press picked up the story because Marcus Donovan getting arrested for assaulting his pregnant wife was the kind of scandal that sold newspapers and generated clicks, the fall from grace narrative that audiences consumed with fascinated horror. His company's board issued a statement distancing themselves from his personal conduct while supporting his continued role as CEO. Corporate doublespeak that meant they'd wait to see how the legal case unfolded before deciding whether to sacrifice him for public relations purposes. His business partners sent carefully worded messages that were supportive enough to maintain relationships but vague enough to allow later denial of association if the accusations proved true and damaging. Caroline was moved to a safe house location kept confidential even from most law enforcement to prevent Marcus or anyone in his network from tracking her down. The facility was run by an organization specializing in high-risk domestic violence cases, survivors fleeing partners with resources and connections that made traditional shelters inadequate protection. Ethan arranged private security in addition to the safe house protocols, hiring 2 former Special Forces operatives who understood that Marcus's money could buy information and access that restraining orders couldn't prevent. The baby continued to grow inside her, oblivious to the legal battles and safety protocols and life reconstruction happening around them. Caroline felt each movement with gratitude and guilt, grateful that her child had survived Marcus's violence but guilty that they'd been exposed to it in the first place, that they were being born into a situation where their father was a documented abuser rather than the man Caroline had once believed he could be. She attended prenatal appointments with security escorts, submitted to monitoring and testing that confirmed the baby was developing normally despite the trauma, and tried to reconcile the joy of impending motherhood with the fear of bringing a child into a world where their father might use them as leverage for control. Marcus's lawyers filed motions requesting visitation rights to his unborn child, legal maneuvering designed to establish parental access that Caroline knew was really about maintaining power over her through their baby. Night terrors plagued her sleep, dreams where Marcus found the safe house and finished what he'd started at the gas station, nightmares where she woke up to find him standing over her hospital bed after she gave birth, visions of losing her baby to a man who'd demonstrated through violence that he viewed them both as property rather than people deserving protection. She'd wake gasping and reaching for her stomach, needing to feel the baby moving to confirm they were both still alive, still fighting, still surviving. Ethan stayed close, sleeping on the couch in the safe house common room because leaving his sister alone felt like abandoning her to danger even with professional security present. He attended every doctor's appointment, every legal consultation, every therapy session where Caroline worked through trauma with a counselor who specialized in helping abuse survivors rebuild their sense of safety and autonomy. He watched his sister transform from a woman who'd been performing happiness to survive into someone harder and more certain, someone who'd been broken by violence and was reconstructing herself from more honest materials. The prosecutor assigned to Marcus's case was a woman named District Attorney Lisa Chen, someone with a reputation for taking domestic violence cases seriously and refusing to plea bargain down to lesser charges that let abusers avoid real consequences. She met with Caroline multiple times, documenting injuries and building a timeline of abuse that extended far beyond the gas station assault, creating a narrative that showed pattern and escalation rather than isolated incident. Marcus's defense will argue this was out of character, Lisa explained during one of their meetings. They'll present him as a successful businessman under unusual stress who made a terrible mistake. We need to prove this wasn't a mistake but a culmination of systematic abuse. Every instance you can document, every threat you can corroborate, every witness who saw bruises you tried to hide, all of it builds the case that Marcus Donovan is a danger not just to you but to your child. The trial date was set for 3 months away, deliberately scheduled to allow Caroline to give birth and recover before having to face Marcus in court. The time between arraignment and trial felt suspended, days bleeding into each other while Caroline existed in protective custody and waited for her body to either heal or deliver the baby that represented both hope and vulnerability. She prepared her testimony with Lisa's help, practicing how to tell her story without breaking down, how to answer defense questions designed to discredit her, how to survive cross-examination from lawyers whose job was to make her seem unstable or vindictive rather than truthful. Marcus's public relations team worked overtime crafting a counter-narrative, leaking stories to sympathetic journalists about Caroline's supposed instability, her alleged financial motivations for making false accusations, the stress Marcus had been under that might explain temporary loss of control. The smear campaign was predictable but effective, poisoning public opinion in ways that would influence jury selection and make Caroline's testimony harder to believe despite overwhelming physical evidence. But somewhere between the legal maneuvering and the public relations warfare and the slow healing of broken ribs that would never quite feel the same, Caroline found something she'd lost during her marriage: the absolute certainty that surviving Marcus was only the first step in building a life worth living, that escape was meaningless without reconstruction, and that the baby growing inside her deserved a mother who was more than just a survivor but someone strong enough to ensure violence never touched them again. Caroline went into labor 3 weeks before her due date, her water breaking at 2 a.m. while she lay in the safe house bed trying to sleep through anxiety that had become her constant companion. The contractions started immediately, sharp and insistent, her body deciding that waiting for the court-scheduled timeline wasn't an option when survival required adaptation. Ethan drove her to the hospital with security following in a separate vehicle, both of them hyper-aware that childbirth made her vulnerable in ways that went beyond medical complications, that Marcus knowing she was in labor could trigger attempts at contact or worse. The labor lasted 14 hours, each contraction a reminder that her body had survived violence designed to end this pregnancy, that the baby fighting to be born was already stronger than the man who'd tried to destroy them both. Ethan stayed in the delivery room because Caroline had no one else, because the person who should have been holding her hand and counting breaths was the reason she needed security guards posted outside her hospital door. The nurses were kind and efficient, treating her with the gentle competence of people who understood that bringing life into the world after trauma required extra care and patience. When her daughter finally emerged, tiny and furious and absolutely perfect, Caroline felt something inside her that had been frozen by years of abuse suddenly thaw with painful intensity. She held her baby against her chest and cried tears that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the overwhelming realization that she'd created life that Marcus couldn't touch, couldn't contaminate, couldn't use as a weapon if she fought hard enough to protect it. "Lily," Caroline whispered, naming her daughter after her grandmother who'd survived her own version of impossible circumstances and taught Caroline that women in their family didn't break, they bent and rebuilt and emerged stronger. Ethan looked at his niece with an expression of fierce protectiveness that promised this child would never know what her mother had endured, would grow up understanding that men who loved you didn't hurt you, that violence wasn't affection and control wasn't care. He took photos on his phone that Caroline would later frame, images of those first moments of life untouched by the violence that had preceded them, evidence that beauty could emerge from trauma if you survived long enough to witness it. Marcus found out about Lily's birth within hours, his network of contacts and resources ensuring that confidentiality policies meant nothing when you had money to buy information. His lawyers filed emergency motions requesting immediate visitation rights, claiming paternal interest and arguing that Caroline was violating his rights by keeping him from his daughter. The judge denied the motions citing ongoing criminal charges and documented history of violence, but the legal maneuvering sent a clear message: Marcus had no intention of allowing Caroline to escape with their child, would use every resource available to maintain control even from a distance. Caroline spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from childbirth and adjusting to the reality of being a mother in protective custody, learning to breastfeed while security guards stood outside her door, processing the complicated joy of new life mixed with fear that Marcus would find a way to take this from her too. Lily was healthy despite being early, her lungs strong and her appetite fierce, and Caroline marveled at how something so small and vulnerable could feel simultaneously like her greatest weakness and her most powerful reason to keep fighting. The safe house became home in ways Caroline's penthouse with Marcus never had, the small room feeling safer than luxury ever could when luxury came with the price of constant vigilance against the person who was supposed to love you. She established routines that centered Lily's needs, feeding schedules and nap times, and the exhausting blur of new motherhood made more complicated by the fact that she was simultaneously preparing to testify against her daughter's father in a criminal trial that would determine whether he spent years in prison or walked free. Lisichin visited regularly, helping Caroline refine her testimony and prepare for the psychological warfare of cross-examination. Marcus's defense team will try to paint you as an opportunist, Lisa explained during one of their sessions while Lily slept in a bassinet nearby. They'll suggest you're using domestic violence allegations to secure a favorable divorce settlement, that you're an unfit mother trying to weaponize the legal system against a successful man. Every choice you made during the marriage will be dissected and judged by people who've never had to survive what you survived. Caroline looked at her sleeping daughter and felt resolve that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with protection. Let them try. I have hospital records documenting injuries from 2 years of abuse. I have witness statements from the gas station. I have medical reports showing broken ribs and defensive wounds consistent with being beaten. And I have 3 months of therapy notes showing the psychological damage from systematic control and violence. They can question my motives all they want, but they can't erase evidence. The trial began on a cold morning in November, the courthouse surrounded by media trucks and protesters holding signs both supporting and condemning Caroline depending on which narrative they'd chosen to believe. Marcus arrived in an expensive suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, flanked by lawyers who exuded the confident arrogance of people accustomed to winning through attrition and intimidation. He looked directly at Caroline as he entered the courtroom, his expression carrying a message that needed no words. This wasn't over, would never be over, and she'd pay for daring to expose him. Caroline sat at the prosecution table wearing a simple dress that cost $30 and holding none of the designer accessories she'd accumulated during her marriage, her appearance carefully calculated to present as sympathetic victim rather than wealthy wife seeking attention. Ethan sat in the gallery directly behind her, his presence a reminder that she wasn't alone even when everything felt designed to isolate and overwhelm her. Jury selection took 2 days, 12 people and 4 alternates chosen from a pool questioned extensively about their ability to remain impartial about domestic violence despite the media coverage that had saturated public consciousness with competing narratives. The prosecution wanted jurors who understood that abuse existed behind closed doors regardless of public persona, while the defense sought people who believed false accusations were common and successful men were frequent targets of opportunistic partners. Opening statements established the battle lines clearly. Lisichin presented Caroline's story with prosecutorial precision, describing a pattern of escalating violence that culminated in a brutal assault on a pregnant woman witnessed by multiple bystanders and documented through medical evidence. Marcus's lead attorney, a man named Richard Steele with a reputation for destroying witnesses on cross-examination, countered with a narrative of a troubled marriage where both parties shared blame, where one isolated incident had been blown out of proportion by a vindictive wife seeking financial gain. The prosecution called witnesses systematically over 3 days, building a timeline of abuse that extended far beyond the gas station assault. Caroline's former neighbor testified about hearing arguments through shared walls, about seeing Caroline with bruises she'd explained away as clumsiness. An emergency room nurse described treating Caroline for injuries consistent with being struck, noting that she'd seemed afraid and had refused to name who'd hurt her. The paramedic from the gas station recounted finding Caroline on the ground with broken ribs and obvious facial trauma, describing how she'd instinctively protected her pregnant belly even while struggling to breathe. Ethan testified about the coded messages Caroline had sent through a fake social media account, about his growing concern that his sister was in danger but feeling helpless to intervene when she wouldn't explicitly ask for help. He described witnessing Marcus strike Caroline at the gas station with clinical precision, explaining how his military training allowed him to assess the situation and intervene before further harm occurred. Under cross-examination, Steele tried to paint Ethan as an overprotective brother with anger management issues who'd assaulted Marcus based on misunderstanding, but Ethan's calm recitation of facts and refusal to be provoked made those suggestions sound desperate rather than credible. Then Caroline took the stand, and the courtroom went silent with the particular attention people pay when they're about to witness something significant. Lisa guided her through testimony that started with how she'd met Marcus, the courtship that had felt like fairy tale, the gradual transformation from charming partner to controlling husband to violent abuser. Caroline spoke in a steady voice about the first time he'd hit her, the apologies that followed, the pattern of tension building in explosion and remorse that repeated with increasing frequency and decreasing apology. She described living in constant fear, calculating every word and action to minimize violence that felt inevitable regardless of how carefully she performed the role of compliant wife. She testified about being pregnant and terrified, about Marcus punching her stomach and threatening to make sure she lost the baby if she didn't learn obedience. She recounted the gas station assault in detail that matched witness statements and medical records, describing how his fist had connected with her ribs with enough force that she'd heard something crack, how she'd fallen to the pavement trying to protect Lily even while pain made breathing feel impossible. Under direct examination, Caroline was composed and credible, her testimony supported by overwhelming evidence that made her story difficult to dismiss as fabrication or exaggeration. But cross-examination was designed to destroy that credibility, and Richard Steele approached with the calculated cruelty of someone whose job required making victims look like villains. He questioned why she'd stayed if the abuse was as bad as she claimed, suggesting that remaining in the marriage indicated either the violence wasn't that severe or she was motivated by access to Marcus's wealth rather than genuine fear. Caroline met his implications with answers she'd practiced but still hurt to deliver. I stayed because he told me he'd kill me if I left. I stayed because I had no money of my own and no job because he'd made me quit. I stayed because he'd isolated me from everyone who might have helped me escape. I stayed because women in abusive relationships stay for an average of 7 times before successfully leaving, and I'd only gotten to attempt 2 before he nearly killed me in public where someone finally intervened. Steele questioned her decision to carry the pregnancy to term, suggesting that if she'd truly feared Marcus, she would have terminated rather than bringing a child into a dangerous situation. The question was designed to make her look either irresponsible or dishonest, but Caroline refused to accept the premise that her choice to have her daughter required justification. I chose to have my baby because she was mine, because Marcus didn't get to make that decision, because surviving his violence to bring life into the world felt like the only way to prove he hadn't destroyed everything worth protecting. The cross-examination lasted 6 hours over 2 days, every aspect of Caroline's character and choices subjected to analysis designed to make the jury question her motives and credibility. But Steele made a critical error in his closing questions, asking with obvious skepticism whether Caroline really expected the jury to believe that Marcus Donovan, successful CEO and respected businessman, was the monster she described. Caroline looked directly at the jury and answered with devastating simplicity, "Monsters don't announce themselves. They look like successful businessmen and charming husbands and people you'd never suspect. That's how they get away with it for so long. That's why I'm asking you to believe evidence instead of reputation." Marcus's defense presented character witnesses who testified about his professional accomplishments and philanthropic work, colleagues who'd never seen any indication of violence or aggression in business settings. His mother took the stand and cried while describing her son as gentle and kind, suggesting that Caroline must have provoked him beyond endurance to trigger behavior so out of character. The strategy was predictable: paint Marcus as fundamentally good man who'd made one mistake under extraordinary circumstances rather than someone whose violence was systematic and intentional. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. Lisa Chen presented expert testimony from a psychologist specializing in domestic violence, explaining how abusers often maintain successful public personas while terrorizing partners in private, how violence escalated during pregnancy when victims were most vulnerable, how patterns of control and isolation were textbook indicators of abuse that preceded physical violence. The expert examined Caroline's testimony and medical records and concluded with professional certainty that her account was consistent with someone who'd survived years of systematic abuse rather than someone fabricating allegations for personal gain. Closing arguments synthesized weeks of testimony into competing narratives. Lisa Chen reminded the jury that believing Caroline required only accepting documented evidence, hospital records, witness statements, photographs of injuries, expert analysis confirming abuse patterns. Believing Marcus required dismissing all that evidence and accepting that a pregnant woman had somehow orchestrated an elaborate false accusation complete with self-inflicted broken ribs and multiple corroborating witnesses. The choice, Lisa argued, wasn't complicated when you prioritized evidence over reputation. Richard Steele countered that reasonable doubt existed wherever motives could be questioned, that Caroline's financial interest in divorce proceedings gave her reason to exaggerate or fabricate, that one incident witnessed in public didn't prove systematic abuse occurred in private. He reminded jurors that destroying a man's reputation and freedom required absolute certainty, that Marcus Donovan deserved the presumption of innocence that American justice guaranteed regardless of public opinion or emotional testimony. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days, and Caroline spent that time in a witness room holding Lily and trying not to imagine what her life would look like if Marcus was acquitted, if the legal system decided that evidence wasn't enough to overcome the benefit of doubt extended to powerful men. Ethan sat with her in silence because there was nothing to say that would make the waiting easier, nothing to do except exist through uncertainty until 12 strangers decided whether justice looked like accountability or permission to continue violence without consequence. When the verdict came back guilty on all charges, felony assault, domestic violence, child endangerment, Caroline felt something that wasn't quite relief because relief implied the trauma was over rather than just legally acknowledged. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his lawyer already preparing appeals and motions that would delay sentencing and allow Marcus to remain free on bail while the legal process ground forward with exhausting slowness. But the guilty verdict changed everything in ways that transcended legal technicalities. Marcus's company board voted to remove him as CEO, corporate sponsors severed relationships, business partners distanced themselves from someone whose violence had been proven in court rather than just alleged in media coverage. The empire Marcus had built through ruthlessness crumbled faster than Caroline's marriage had, proving that reputation could be destroyed as quickly as it had been constructed when evidence contradicted carefully managed image. Sentencing occurred 6 weeks later, Marcus receiving 8 years in prison with possibility of parole after 5, a sentence that felt simultaneously too long and not long enough depending on whether you measured justice in years stolen from his life or years Caroline would spend recovering from his violence. The judge delivered a statement before pronouncing sentence, noting that domestic violence against pregnant women represented a particular cruelty that warranted significant punishment, that Marcus's resources and position made him more rather than less culpable because he'd used power to terrorize someone dependent on him. Caroline didn't attend sentencing because Marcus didn't deserve to see her or Lily, didn't deserve the satisfaction of knowing they were still defined by his violence even through punishment. She watched the news coverage from the safe house, Lily asleep in her arms, and felt the peculiar emptiness of winning a battle that had cost her years of her life and pieces of herself she'd never fully recover. The divorce proceedings that followed were brutal in different ways. Custody battles fought over a child Marcus had tried to beat out of existence before deciding fatherhood gave him leverage over Caroline's freedom. His lawyers argued for visitation rights from prison, claiming that parental bonds shouldn't be severed despite criminal conviction. Caroline's legal team countered that a man convicted of assaulting his pregnant wife had forfeited any claim to relationship with the child that violence had targeted. The family court judge ruled in Caroline's favor, terminating Marcus's parental rights based on documented danger to both mother and child, severing the legal connection that might have required Caroline to maintain contact with her abuser through co-parenting arrangements. Marcus's final tie to Caroline and Lily was cut through judicial decision, and Caroline felt lighter than she had in years, like she'd been carrying weight she'd become so accustomed to that she'd forgotten what moving freely felt like. Rebuilding her life happened in increments too small to feel like progress until she looked back and realized how far she'd traveled from the woman who'd fallen on gas station concrete believing she deserved the violence that had put her there. She moved out of the safe house into a modest apartment in a neighborhood where people knew each other's names, where children played in parks without security escorts, where normal felt like luxury after years of living in gilded cage. She started therapy 3 times a week, processing trauma with a counselor who specialized in helping abuse survivors reclaim their sense of safety and autonomy. She reconnected with friends she'd lost during her marriage, explaining her absence in ways that made them cry and apologize for not recognizing the signs they'd been trained to ignore by a culture that refused to see domestic violence when it was inconvenient. She took online classes to update skills that had atrophied during years of forced unemployment, slowly rebuilding the career Marcus had made her abandon. She accepted help from Ethan and her mother and the support network that materialized once she stopped hiding the truth about what she'd survived. She learned to sleep without nightmares, to exist without constantly calculating danger, to trust that the life she was building wouldn't be destroyed by someone who'd decided she was property rather than person. Lily grew into a bright, healthy toddler with Caroline's smile and none of Marcus's cruelty, living proof that children could be protected from generational violence if the cycle was broken with enough force and determination. Caroline told her daughter age-appropriate versions of their story, explaining that sometimes people make bad choices but that didn't mean you were defined by someone else's mistakes. She promised Lily would grow up knowing that love looked like safety and respect, that relationships required equality not submission, that her worth wasn't determined by anyone except herself. On Lily's third birthday, Caroline took her daughter to the park where she'd once taken prenatal walks trying to imagine what motherhood would look like on the other side of violence. They fed ducks at the pond and played on swings and ate birthday cake that cost $12 from a grocery store bakery, celebrating life that was modest and safe and free in ways Marcus's money never could have purchased. Ethan joined them with his partner Sarah, a surgical nurse he'd met during Caroline's recovery, and they took photos that would later be framed as evidence of the family Caroline had rebuilt from honest materials. That evening, Caroline stood in her apartment kitchen washing dishes while Lily slept in the next room, and she thought about the woman she'd been 4 years ago, performing happiness while dying inside, believing escape was impossible because powerful men didn't face consequences and no one would believe her story. She thought about the gas station where chance and timing had intersected to save her life, about Ethan arriving exactly when she needed him most, about the strangers who'd filmed Marcus's violence and testified on her behalf despite having no obligation to involve themselves in another person's nightmare. She thought about the justice system that had finally worked despite being designed in ways that often protected abusers, about the guilty verdict that had validated her truth when so many victims never received that acknowledgement. She thought about Lily sleeping safely in a home where violence didn't exist, where childhood meant protection rather than collateral damage in adult warfare. And she felt something that had been absent for years finally settle into place, the certainty that she'd survived not just Marcus's violence but the systematic forces that enabled it, that she'd transformed from victim into survivor into someone building a life where the past informed her strength but didn't define her future. The scars remained, both physical and psychological. Her ribs ached in cold weather. Sudden loud noises triggered panic responses that therapy was slowly healing. She still struggled with trust and intimacy and the vulnerability required for healthy relationships. But Caroline Donovan, who'd lost her surname along with her marriage, understood that healing wasn't about erasing damage but learning to carry it without letting it control your trajectory. She'd built an empire from the wreckage of Marcus's violence, one constructed from her daughter's laughter and her own determination and the stubborn refusal to let the worst thing that happened to her become the only thing that defined her existence. She was 32 years old, a single mother working 2 jobs and taking night classes, living in an apartment that would never appear in magazines or impress people who measured success in square footage and luxury brands. And she was happier than she'd ever been in the penthouse where money had camouflaged violence and success had masked systematic cruelty. Because she'd learned what Marcus never understood, that the greatest empire you can build is the one where safety allows you to become whoever you were meant to be before someone tried to break you into a shape that served their ego instead of your humanity. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.